In the middle of the 18th century, along the wet southwestern coast of Ceylon, men entered the cinnamon country carrying knives, scraping tools, and obligations they had not freely chosen. They cut young stems close to the ground, stripped away the rough outer bark, and searched for the pale, fragrant layer beneath it. Colonial officials measured what they returned. Quotas mattered. Quality mattered. A family's place inside the company's labor system could depend on bark thin enough to curl as it dried. More than 5,000 miles away, European buyers encountered the result as a delicate brown tube. They grated it into sauces, medicines, pastries, wine, and luxury drinks. Today, a jar of cinnamon can sit beside ordinary sugar and salt, cheap enough to shake carelessly over breakfast. Yet the stick inside that jar is the remains of a political system. It is tree bark shaped by extraordinary skill, carried through trade routes older than many kingdoms, and once guarded by empires that turned an island's landscape and its people into machinery for controlling flavor. The strangest part is that the cinnamon most people buy today is often not the same species that made Ceylon famous. The old imperial prize was Ceylon cinnamon, the thin inner bark of a tree native to Sri Lanka. Much of the modern market is dominated by thicker, sharper cassia from other parts of Asia. One name now covers several different trees, several different flavors, and a history in which rarity was slowly replaced by substitution. So how did a layer of bark become sacred incense, royal medicine, maritime intelligence, colonial tribute, coerced labor, and finally supermarket powder? Why did merchants hide its origin behind monsters and impossible birds? Why did European powers fight for the coast of Sri Lanka, then regulate who could peel a tree? And how did the original luxury become so common that many consumers no longer know which cinnamon they are eating? If you like stories where ordinary food turns into empire, trade, obsession, and hidden history, subscribe to Food Empire History. Now, to understand how cinnamon became this powerful, we have to go back to where the story really begins. True cinnamon begins in a wet tropical landscape. Cinnamomum verum is a member of the laurel family, native to Sri Lanka, where heat, monsoon rain, and humid soil support an evergreen tree whose most valuable part is hidden beneath its surface. The leaves are aromatic. The roots and oils have uses of their own, but the famous spice comes from the inner bark, a living layer that carries water and nutrients through the stem. That makes cinnamon biologically unusual as a food. A peppercorn is a fruit, a clove is a flower bud, nutmeg is a seed. Cinnamon is protection and circulation, the skin beneath the skin of a tree. To harvest it well, the worker must damage the stem without wasting what matters. The rough exterior is scraped away. The inner bark is loosened and lifted in long sections. As moisture leaves, the strips curl inward, forming the quills that later look so effortless in a glass jar. The tree can survive this treatment because cinnamon is managed through coppicing. Stems are cut, and new shoots rise again from the base. A plantation therefore becomes a cycle of cutting, regrowth, judgment, and timing. Bark taken from the wrong stem, in the wrong season, or handled without enough skill, will not produce the finest thin quills. The object that European consumers treated as a natural treasure was also a manufactured form, created by generations of Sri Lankan botanical knowledge and handwork. Cinnamon's earliest history is difficult because ancient names were not botanical labels. Writers used words translated as cinnamon and cassia for different aromatic barks, and later historians often assumed those words always meant the species sold under those names today. They did not. Claims that true Sri Lankan cinnamon filled the tombs of the earliest Egyptian pharaohs are far less secure than popular histories suggest. Ancient embalming certainly used complex aromatic materials, but identifying one degraded substance as modern Ceylon cinnamon is another matter. What archaeology does show is still remarkable. Residue analysis of small Phoenician flasks from the early Iron Age found evidence of cinnamon that had come from South or Southeast Asia. By the 11th to late 10th centuries before the Common Era, an aromatic product had crossed an enormous distance through linked maritime and overland networks. No surviving ledger records every hand that moved it. The bark may have passed from island growers to regional sailors, from Indian Ocean ports to Arabian merchants, and from the Red Sea toward the Mediterranean. That distance transformed flavor into mystery. A buyer at the western end of the route did not see the tree, the monsoon, or the person peeling the bark. He saw a dry fragment with an impossible smell and an origin that disappeared somewhere beyond several commercial middlemen. The less Europe knew, the easier it was to imagine that cinnamon came from the edge of the world. Herodotus repeated stories in which dangerous winged creatures guarded cinnamon, and giant birds built nests from its sticks. Collectors supposedly lured the birds with heavy pieces of meat until the nests collapsed. Other tales placed aromatic barks in swamps protected by bats or serpents. These were not reliable maps. They were stories about distance, risk, and commercial secrecy, repeated because they made an already expensive object feel even more unreachable. In the ancient Mediterranean, aromatic bark moved between medicine, ritual, perfume, and status. It could be burned as an offering, mixed into preparations, or displayed as a gift suitable for rulers and gods. Roman writers complained about the money flowing eastward for luxuries, and cinnamon belonged to that larger anxiety. A spice that weighed almost nothing could absorb silver, survive a long voyage, and announce wealth the moment its scent entered a room. Its usefulness was not limited to sweetness. Cinnamon brought warmth and bitterness as well as fragrance. It entered meat dishes, wine, ointments, incense, and medicinal traditions. But many claims made for it were cultural rather than clinically proven. Its reputation grew because smell itself suggested power. Strong aromatics seemed able to purify air, preserve bodies, strengthen digestion, or defend the vulnerable human body against corruption. For centuries, the people closest to European consumers still did not control the source. Muslim merchants, Indian Ocean sailors, South Asian rulers, and trading communities connected Sri Lanka to ports across Arabia and the eastern Mediterranean. Cargo moved with the monsoon. Ships waited for winds that reversed direction with the seasons. At Alexandria and other commercial centers, spices passed into Mediterranean distribution. Venetian merchants became important suppliers to European markets, but they stood near the end of a much longer Asian and Middle Eastern chain. By the medieval period, cinnamon had become a language of class in European kitchens. It appeared in spiced sauces, elite meat dishes, wine, and medical recipes. Its presence did not simply improve taste. It demonstrated access to distant trade. A household serving cinnamon was placing geography on the table. The bark had crossed oceans, deserts, taxes, warehouses, and credit networks before reaching a kitchen where most people had never seen a tropical tree. Secrecy protected margins. European travelers heard that cinnamon grew near the Nile, washed down from unknown lands, or had to be collected through fantastic danger. Even when fragments of accurate information emerged, the full geography remained blurred. Merchants did not need every myth to be invented as a deliberate lie. They only needed uncertainty to survive. When no buyer could travel directly to the tree, the route itself became part of the price. Then European ships began trying to break the route. The Portuguese did not sail into the Indian Ocean because of cinnamon alone. They wanted direct access to Asian wealth, Christian allies, strategic ports, and the spice trade as a whole. But when Portuguese fleets reached Sri Lanka in the early 16th century, they encountered an island whose cinnamon was already a royal resource and a commercial prize. The Kingdom of Kotta drew revenue from it, while Muslim merchants had long helped connect the island's exports to wider markets. Trade agreements became tribute agreements. Forts rose near the coast. Political alliances pulled Portuguese officers deeper into conflicts among Sri Lankan kingdoms. Cinnamon moved from a commodity purchased through negotiation toward a product claimed through armed influence. A payment measured in bark could become a sign of submission. A port built to protect commerce could become a base for territorial power. The Portuguese tried to restrict the trade and secure annual deliveries, yet control remained incomplete. Sri Lanka was not an empty spice garden waiting for Europeans. It contained competing kingdoms, established merchant communities, agricultural systems, religious institutions, and populations able to resist. The inland kingdom of Kandy remained a major obstacle. The Portuguese could dominate coastal positions and demand cinnamon, but they could not turn the entire island into a quiet warehouse. A new European company offered Kandy a weapon against them. In the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company arrived with ships, artillery, contracts, and the authority to wage war. The VOC presented itself as an ally that could help expel the Portuguese. Kandyan rulers expected captured territories to return to their control. The company had a different understanding. Once the Portuguese forts fell, the Dutch stayed. Gala was taken in 1640. Colombo surrendered in 1656. By 1658, the Portuguese had been expelled from their remaining coastal strongholds. The Cinnamon Coast had changed European owners, but it had not been liberated from monopoly. The VOC occupied the ports, controlled export channels, and built a colonial administration around the same bark it had promised to free from Portuguese hands. This was the decisive transformation. Cinnamon was no longer merely cargo moving through a route. It became a reason to govern territory. The company mapped land, registered people, negotiated with chiefs, issued regulations, inspected production, and used military power to exclude rivals. A tree that grew in the island's forests was reorganized as company property before it was ever placed aboard a ship. The VOC's power rested on more than European employees. It depended on local intermediaries, officials, headmen, transport workers, cultivators, and especially the communities assigned to cinnamon service. Members of the Salagama caste were identified by the Dutch as cinnamon peelers. Their obligation had roots in earlier systems of service, but the company sharpened it into a colonial labor regime designed for export. This was corvée labor, compulsory work demanded through political authority rather than an ordinary free contract. Peeling required precision. Workers traveled into cinnamon areas, cut stems, scraped bark, formed quills, and delivered quantities subject to inspection. The company gained a globally valuable product without paying the full cost that a free labor market might have demanded. The difference traveled upward as monopoly profit. A cinnamon quill therefore held two kinds of skill. It showed the expertise of the peeler because the finest bark had to be removed without breaking and assembled into long, delicate rolls. It also showed the coercion surrounding that expertise. European consumers enjoyed a refined product, while the colonial system treated the people capable of making it as a registered labor category. Control reached into the landscape. Wild cinnamon resources could be restricted, counted, or destroyed when they threatened planned supply. Cultivation expanded under Dutch rule, especially as the company tried to replace uncertain collection with predictable production. The goal was not to grow as much cinnamon as possible. The goal was to grow the amount that protected monopoly prices and company authority. That distinction explains the logic of spice empire. Scarcity was valuable only when someone could control it. Too little cinnamon meant lost sales. Too much could reduce the price. The profitable point lay between them, and the VOC tried to occupy that point with forts on the coast, rules on the island, and auctions in Europe. The tree became part of an early global calculation connecting a worker's knife in Ceylon to a merchant's ledger in Amsterdam. The human cost was not identical to the plantation slavery that shaped Atlantic sugar, and it should not be collapsed into the same category. But it was still coerced labor. People's social identity, taxation, residence, and obligations could be used to secure work for a colonial company. Resistance took many forms, from evasion and poor quality delivery to flight, negotiation, and support for rival political powers. The cinnamon monopoly was never as smooth on the ground as it appeared in a European account book, nor was the VOC alone in benefiting. Local elites and intermediaries could use company administration to protect or improve their own position. Colonial systems rarely operated through foreigners commanding a completely separate society. They worked by entering existing hierarchies, rewarding cooperation, hardening categories, and redirecting obligations toward global commerce. Cinnamon did not erase Sri Lankan politics, it became entangled with them. By the 18th century, Dutch Ceylon had become a laboratory of commercial government. Registers followed families, courts and councils extended company authority. Religious affiliation, education, and employment could intersect with colonial status. Behind the familiar image of a spice ship stood a bureaucracy trying to make people legible, labor available, and bark countable. Yet monopoly contained the seed of its own collapse. The more valuable Ceylon cinnamon became, the more rivals wanted living plants, skilled knowledge, and alternative species. Cinnamon and cassia trees already grew across parts of Asia, and colonial states experimented with cultivation beyond Sri Lanka. A secret becomes weaker once it can be planted. The British took control of Ceylon from the Dutch in 1796. They inherited the cinnamon system and continued a state monopoly for a time, but the 19th century world was changing. Competing supplies expanded. Cassia from China and Southeast Asia could deliver a stronger flavor at lower cost. Plantations and trade networks spread aromatic bark across more tropical regions. Ceylon no longer possessed the only product that European consumers were willing to call cinnamon. This was cinnamon's industrial revolution, and its central invention was not one machine. It was replacement at scale. Steamships reduced travel time. Mechanized mills turned bark into consistent powder. Printed packaging separated consumers from the original quill. Expanding sugar and baking industries created enormous demand for a warm, forceful flavor. Cassia was thicker, darker, cheaper, and intense enough to survive factories, storage, and standardized recipes. Cheap cinnamon did not simply bring an old luxury to more people, it changed the expected taste of cinnamon itself. The delicate citrus and floral notes associated with Ceylon bark were increasingly overshadowed by cassia's harder sweetness and heat. Industrial recipes rewarded impact, consistency, and price. Consumers adapted to the substitute, then treated the substitute as the standard. A product could conquer the mass market by becoming less like the object that had created its original fame. The luxury bark became an ingredient system. Ground cinnamon entered bakeries, confectionery, breakfast foods, spice blends, drinks, and household tins. Once pulverized, botanical identity became difficult to see. A Ceylon quill has many thin papery layers. Cassia usually forms a harder roll of thick bark. In powder, those visual clues disappear. The label becomes more powerful than the tree. The result was a reversal. For centuries, cinnamon's value came from people not knowing where it grew. In the modern market, value often comes from people not knowing what species they bought. The old secret hid a place. The new ambiguity hides a substitution. Today, the world's cinnamon supply is concentrated in China, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka, but those countries do not produce the same bark. Ceylon cinnamon remains closely identified with Sri Lanka and commands a premium for its thin texture and mild layered aroma. Cassia varieties dominate much of mass-market production because they are cheaper and deliver the bold flavor many consumers now recognize as cinnamon. The chemistry also differs. Cassia naturally contains much more coumarin, an aromatic compound that can damage the liver in sensitive people when exposure is high and prolonged. Ceylon cinnamon generally contains far less. This does not make an ordinary cinnamon bun a medical emergency, And cinnamon is not a proven cure for diabetes or weight loss. It means species and dose matter, especially when people consume large amounts or concentrated supplements. The supermarket does not always make that distinction clear. Both products may simply be labeled cinnamon. In whole sticks, a careful buyer can often see the difference. In powder, verification requires chemical and botanical testing. That weakness has created room for mislabeling, dilution, substitution, and contamination. A European Commission investigation published in 2025 tested more than 100 cinnamon samples from retailers. More than two-thirds showed at least one serious irregularity involving quality standards, food safety compliance, suspected fraud, or potentially excessive coumarin. Some products labeled Ceylon cinnamon contained cassia. Other samples appeared to include non-bark parts of the tree, and some exceeded the European limit for lead. The numbers matter because they expose the modern form of the old cinnamon problem. Consumers still purchase an invisible chain. They do not see the species, the grove, the peeler, the mill, or the broker. They see brown powder and a familiar word. The trade is no longer guarded by Portuguese cannon or VOC forts, but information remains unevenly distributed between seller and buyer. Meanwhile, the oldest part of the story has not disappeared. Fine Ceylon cinnamon still depends heavily on skilled peeling. Stems must be selected, cleaned, rubbed, cut and lifted with practiced hands. Thin pieces are nested together to form long quills and dried into the fragile rolls that distinguish the product. Machines can assist parts of the process, but the highest grades still reveal human judgment in every layer. That skill has survived Portuguese tribute, Dutch corvée, British monopoly, industrial substitution, and modern fraud. It belongs not to the empires that claimed cinnamon, but to the people who learned how to read a tree. Empires controlled ports and prices. They could order deliveries, seize forts, issue regulations, and rename an island. They could not invent the knowledge already held in the worker's hand. Now return to the cinnamon in your kitchen. Open the jar and look closely. If it is powder, the tree has almost completely vanished. If it is a thick, dark stick with one hard curl, it is probably cassia. If it is pale and built from many thin layers, it may be Ceylon cinnamon, the descendant of the bark that drew merchants across the Indian Ocean and colonial powers onto Sri Lanka's coast. Either way, the smell is carrying more than comfort. It carries ancient roots whose first links are still debated. It carries stories of sacred smoke, elite tables, merchant secrecy, monsoon sailing, tribute, forts, coerced labor, cultivation, machines, and substitution. The same aroma that once proved distance now feels like home. Cinnamon's great historical trick was to make violence smell warm. It arrived in European kitchens, separated from the people who peeled it and the governments that controlled them. Later, industrial food separated the flavor even from the species that first made it famous. Familiarity erased geography, and powder erased evidence, but the bark remembers its structure. Layer inside layer, it preserves the shape of the system that made it. A hidden living tissue became a luxury. Luxury became monopoly. Monopoly became colonial government. Government became mass trade. Mass trade turned several trees into one word. The next time cinnamon falls across coffee, oatmeal, rice, fruit, or dough, the gesture will still be ordinary. That is exactly why the history matters. A substance once guarded through war, tribute, forced service, and commercial secrecy now leaves the jar through a row of tiny holes. If this story changed the way you see cinnamon, subscribe for more hidden food histories.